The Inspiration Sessions podcast series has been specially created by the Elevate team, ensuring that the Elevate community receives the most valuable and impactful tools, resources, and inspiration. In this episode, Jez Paxman, Live Union Strategy Director and one of the agency's founders, talks about how to create unboring B2B events that connect people more effectively with ideas and one another. He offers 3 simple solutions. Don't design a business event, do design an event you genuinely like to attend, and do sweat the small stuff. His overarching message is that B2B events should stop relying on traditional corporate formulas and instead be shaped around what people actually want: meaningful ideas, human connection, conversation, and memorable experiences.
Jez, hi.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Tell us a bit about you and your agency, and then we're going to go into the subject of what you're going to talk about. But first, just sort of tell everyone about you and what you do and how long you work there and what stuff.
Sure. So I have been working in events, I suppose, for 25 years. And about 17 years ago, myself and 2 partners founded Live Union. And I'm the strategy director at Live Union. I've always worked in strategy. We focus particularly on B2B, and we really do 3 types of events. We do leadership events, we do employee events, and we do customer events. And we do that for clients like Amazon and Visa and Deloitte and National Grid.
Brilliant. Jez, for anyone that doesn't know what a strategist is, could you just explain?
Yeah, I think in simple terms, you're setting the direction of travel for an event, for an event program. You are the person who's responsible for making sure that the event is delivering value for the audience and also delivering value for the client.
Brilliant. The subject of the podcast, unboring B2B events. Can you just explain a bit about that and explain your thinking around that?
Yeah, sure. Unboring B2B events is really a workshop that we've been running, a program that we've been running, and we've delivered it for loads of large corporates, everybody from sort of Amex to Workday to Deloitte.
Yeah.
And where it originally came from is a stat. So there was a piece of research done by a marketing effectiveness expert called Peter Field for WARC. And his research concluded that 78% of audiences are neutral towards B2B content. And lots of people in the wider sort of marketing world saw that stat, and it became a kind of thing where people sort of slightly reinterpreted that and said 3/4 of audiences are bored by B2B content. And that's kind of hard to argue with when you look at the research. Neutral, boring, there's not much between those 2 words. And when we thought about that from an event point of view, we sort of had to think that actually, events are part of the problem. Of all of the marketing channels out there, there are a lot of B2B events that don't engage audiences like they should. And a lot of that is because a lot of events have created for a world that no longer exists. So that's really where it came from. It also dovetailed really nicely with what we're always talking about at Live Union and what we're always trying to do, which is close this growing engagement gap that businesses are seeing between themselves and their customers and between themselves and their employees. So those sort of things all came together. And then we sort of created a piece of work around that where we thought, how can we take this topic out to people and maybe just come at it from a slightly different angle?
Okay, which is what we're going to talk about now.
Yeah.
Great stuff. So I've got a couple of questions here that I've been kind of thinking about. Aren't all B2B channels faced with the same challenge? Is the challenge of events any greater than any of the other challenges that you might be facing?
I think events are slightly different in some ways because I think events have a kind of innate conservatism. Events don't take risks, and that makes a huge amount of sense for lots of reasons. But one of the reasons is that with events, the stakes are incredibly high and very, very senior people get involved in them. So the example I always use is, do you remember when Theresa May did her Tory party, her Conservative Party conference, and sort of everything went wrong? The letters started falling off the backdrop and all those kind of things. And I think there was a sort of like mini stage invasion and all kind of things like that.
She had the cough. She
had the cough, of course, as well. So, but the point is we ask an awful lot of senior people at events. And because of that, there is a tendency to be even more conservative than they might be anyway. As an aside to that, I heard a story, then this might not be true, but I did hear that before Mark Zuckerberg goes on stage, he gets so nervous that he has somebody blow dry his armpits. Now, that may or may not be true, but I just think it's a really nice reminder in some way, because it's all very well for me to sit here and kind of go, oh, there's lots of boring B2B events out there. There's a really good reason why people don't take risks. And obviously a lot of what we do and a lot of what our competitor agencies do is to reassure clients and to find ways of mitigating that risk.
Interesting. So are B2B events out of sync with audiences?
I think the interesting thing is that, we live in the experience economy. We have been living in the experience economy for decades. And a lot of the creativity that you see in the more kind of organic world of events, I think isn't necessarily coming through into events. And we can go on to talk about some of the great areas that you can draw inspiration from. I think there's another point where events are also, in the B2B space, events are also out of sync with leadership, with what leaders need and what events can deliver for leaders. I saw this lovely expression that the best leaders don't just talk at events, they host conversations. And that sort of goes to this more kind of democratic sense of leadership that's arrived, particularly since the pandemic, or this more consensual sense of leadership. Yet all too often when people design business events, they will have a kind of, person standing on stage, looking down, talking at people, which absolutely flies in the face of how you might use events. And actually, of course, events are they're in some ways the only forum for having face-to-face conversations en masse. And we've done lots of things over the years. We've done things for law firms where we've, completely got rid of this kind of main stage and redesigned the whole space as something, at the time we called it a big debate, but basically a forum for discussion. And I think they're some of the things that are really interesting.
When you talk about unboring, how do you avoid the gimmicks? I mean, they're really obvious ones.
Yeah. I mean, listen, when I talk about this topic, the first thing I always say is, something unboring is just kind of turning up the volume, making events louder. I don't mean louder just in sound, I mean kind of across the board. And there was this awful trend, particularly I think in tech events a few years back, where events started having kind of corporate ball pits, which just sounds like the worst idea, but trust me, it happened. It was out there. So that's not what we're talking about.
Not a corporate pit, no.
We're not talking about corporate ball pits. No, right. I think what we're talking about is very much taking an audience first approach and looking at what people genuinely want from events. And I think a really good thought experiment when you're designing any event is to think, what if this wasn't a business event? How might you design it differently? Because business events have some kind of inbuilt strictures that come along. They tend to happen in the same type of venues. They tend to happen in the same, in the same hours. Conference venue, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. Now, clearly, there's lots of good reasons why that happens, but I think it is useful to challenge it. And one of the examples I really like is there used to be an event, a paid-for event that happened called Newco. And what Newco was an event that didn't have a venue. So rather than you going to a venue to hear from, they had like lots of sort of tech kind of speakers. So rather than you going to a venue to hear from those speakers, you went to the speakers' offices. So if you were hearing from somebody at Google, you travel to the Google HQ. And then you might be hearing from someone at Amazon, you go to the Amazon HQ. And I just thought that was a really interesting way of doing it because, number one, the speakers were more relaxed because they were in their own offices. Number two, you got to see their offices.
The environment, yeah.
Exactly. And then number three, you're also traveling with the other people who were at the event. So there was a kind of inbuilt kind of networking moment.
Yeah,
so,
right.
I always think that's a really nice way of rethinking it. Another example is there is an incredibly successful thought leadership event called the Do Lectures.
Yeah, I've just been.
Oh, have you? Okay. Well, okay.
Got that last weekend.
Fantastic. All right. Well, you can.
All about it. That's amazing. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah. So if you think about the Do Lectures, I mean, the Do Lectures like started on a farm in Wales, right? And they now happen in Australia. I think they happen in 3 or 4 countries around the world.
And in Australia and California, but mainly in Wales. Yeah, I was on a 1-day retreat, and the actual Do Lectures over 4 days. But yeah, it's a very interesting concept.
Yeah, and but fundamentally, what's interesting about it is that, it's a thought leadership event that's quite expensive to go to, and one imagines there's a lot of people there who are putting it on their expenses. But that's not in a traditional corporate conference event. That happens in a farm. That happens in a barn on a farm in Wales. Yeah,
it takes ages to get there. So it's 5 hours to get there. And they actually say we make it really difficult to get there because that's part of it's like a pilgrimage. Yeah.
So I just think, I think some of those examples, and I think encouraging people to think a little bit differently about the constraints and how you can do things differently.
Have you got any client examples in the B2B world?
Yeah. So, we did an event for a financial services client where the brief came in and they said, we're launching a new B2B product and we'd like to do a 1-day conference, to attract new prospects and to give our salespeople the opportunity to have a conversation and to start to seed the product. When we looked at that, what was really clear is that, number one, if you did a 1-day event, you were going to limit, did people really want to give up a whole day to come to this? So we suggested, rather than doing it across 1 day, why not make it shorter? Why not do it 3 times on the same day? So, that was a big shift, but suddenly that was a really interesting way of designing a business event that worked with people's lives. So people could choose, would they go to the morning event? Would they go to the lunch event? Would they go to the tea time event? And then the next thing we said to them is, we don't think it should be a conference. If you want conversation, if you want people talking, let's not have people on stage. Let's bring the product to life as a kind of walkthrough experience. Let's have your salespeople in that experience. So as your potential customers walk through, you have conversations, you have the content is sparking those conversations because it's all around you. So I think, that's an example of thinking differently about how you design things and not thinking about things, or taking that approach of what would this be if it wasn't a business event.
So have you got any other examples of events that do this really well?
Yep. We work for Amazon, specifically for Amazon Fashion and Sport. And when we do their events, because there's always a very strong brand element to those events, venue is absolutely key. So we will never go to a traditional corporate venue. Rather than that, we're always looking for things that have a sort of retreat vibe to them, if you like. So that sees us, we might be booking private houses. We might be going out looking for, museums that don't normally host events. So that's probably a nice example of, again, going back to the audience, the type of audience they're trying to attract are going to be far more likely to turn up if you have found a really interesting venue and a venue that reinforces the fashion and sport message that they're trying to get across.
I love it. Is there an argument to say make B2B more like B2C, just make it more experiential?
I think it's a little bit different to that. There's a line that I'm sure I bore my colleagues to death with, which is this one. It's about better connecting people to ideas and better connecting people to one another. So, how do you get beyond surface engagement? We always say there are kind of traditional events where engagement is very shallow. So that means sort of conversation is fleeting, ideas are quickly forgotten. And there's the type of events we try to create, which much deeper engagement, more immersive, if you like, where you're trying to get, genuinely meaningful conversation. You're trying to get ideas that land. You're trying to create an event that has the power to change minds and shift behaviors. And that means doing the really hard work of thinking of a sort of micro engagement. So an example to illustrate that I always like is, do you remember years ago, Al Gore did a lecture series called An Inconvenient Truth?
Yeah.
And then that was turned into a film.
Yeah.
And the whole point of that was to raise awareness about rising CO2 emissions. And he had one chart in his lecture which showed how CO2 levels were literally going to go off the top of the screen, off the top of the chart. And him and his team were thinking, how can we land that idea? And, I'm sure lots of designers were redesigning the slide and trying to make it as impactful as possible. And then someone had the absolute genius idea that when they got to that point in the presentation and the animated line started going up, he would get into a scissor lift and follow it up on stage.
Brilliant.
And so, that is a fantastic kind of moment of theatre that landed an idea. That's the kind of thing we're talking about.
That's great. Yeah, that's a really good example. So that's connecting people to ideas. What about connecting people to each other?
Well, again, a lot of this is about drawing ideas from the wider world of events and being a bit magpie-like and seeing things that you like and seeing if you could adapt them in some way. And there's something that I saw that they did at Money 2020, which I think is a really clever piece of thinking. So at Money 2020, they now have stage bars. So the idea is that if a room has a presentation going on in it, at the back of the room, there will be a bar. And that's just really simple human nature, that if you and I are sitting next to each other, we don't know each other, we've both watched this presentation, how are you going to help us connect around that content? Well, if there's a bar at the back where we can easily grab a drink, that is going to work. That is a very human-centric way of designing conversation, rather than saying to us, oh, the networking area is down that corridor and starts at 7:00. So I think, that idea of stage bars is something that's really struck me and stuck with me.
Right. Give me some more examples, Jez.
Yeah, there's something that we did at Live Union, which I was proud of, where a client said to us, it was their leadership event, and they said, and we'll need to have a session on customer service. And when we interrogated this a bit further, we found out that every year they have a session at their leadership event about customer service, because like all businesses, they feel like their customer service could be better.
Yeah.
But of course, the problem is with especially these events that come around year on year, if you keep talking about the same topics, people zone them out. So we said, listen, the last thing we need to do is another presentation on customer service. Let's do something different. So what we did is the audience went into the room. They thought they were going to get a presentation on customer service. Instead, the police burst in, arrested everybody. We set up this conceit that the HQ had been taken hostage by an irate customer. And the leaders then had to work together to solve this particular customer's quite granular problems. What was great about that is that actually, if you use actors, you can get away with things that you can't do without actors.
Yeah.
But it also had, it shocked people and into taking personal responsibility for something. And it got a conversation going in a way that you couldn't have done if you'd used more traditional engagement or more traditional formats.
Yeah. So corporate events seem to have such a small range of formats. Is that part of the problem, do you think?
It absolutely is. And I'm a format obsessive. By the way, there's a wonderful resource called Formats Unpacked, which has been put together by an agency called Story Things. I'd really recommend anybody who wants to explore formats more widely, that's the place to go. There are a huge range of formats outside of the B2B world that can be co-opted and adapted and used as inspiration to do things differently. YouTube, for example, is a great place to go. So one of the ones that I really like is Hot Ones. So Hot Ones, incredibly successful YouTube phenomenon where celebrities come on, effectively a celebrity interview, but the twist is that as the interview progresses, they eat hotter and hotter chicken wings. Right. So what that means is that they lose all of their kind of like PR training and poise, and you get a much more honest and fun and enjoyable conversation. So something like that is now starting to come into the B2B world. So software company SaaS used that format at their flagship user event to interview their CTO. And, so you can talk about these things and everybody goes, oh, that seems a bit left field, or, we'd never do that. These things are already happening, and audiences have an appetite for these more kind of, creative formats. There's other ones out there, Wired Explainers, something that Wired magazine do, where they challenge an expert to explain something really complex to, I can't quite remember this right, but I think it's like a preschooler, a secondary school student, a grad student, and so on. And so, there are those kind of things that you can co-opt, you can take inspiration from, and that gets you to, that is unboring in action.
Yeah, that's a great example. Can you give me some examples of other kind of left field formats that you brought into events? Yes,
I can. I mean, I think one of the challenges with events is obviously, as events become more conversational, as hopefully people are doing more interesting things, more immersive sessions, what gets squeezed is actually the time for senior leaders and senior people to have their kind of stage slot, you know. And we designed a fantastic leadership event for National Grid, where we introduced a format called 2 years in 2 minutes. And this is something that we'd seen politicians do. So I think the former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern started it, where her team said to her, you know, as just a piece of kind of content, they said, right, I want you to, in no more than 2 minutes and one take, I want you to list all the things that your government has successfully done. And then that became, and then lots of other politicians started doing it, and it kind of became a thing around the world. Now, that kind of thing also works really well for leaders, because if you work with a leader and say, okay, rather than having your 45-minute slot or your half-hour slot, you've got 2 minutes to do this. And then that forces them to synthesize it down, to get the points across, and then it frees up time for you to have a conversation.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of expression that they use in education, which is called the flipped classroom. And the idea is that you get content across, not in the classroom, you know, ideally before the class starts, and then you use the time the time in the class to discuss it, because that's how people learn. So, you know, when we did it for National Grid, we played out the videos within the event, but you could also just send those videos out in advance, and then freeing the time for conversation and for more valuable learning.
So as a format obsessive, are there any other formats that you're obsessing about?
Yep. There's one that somebody shared with me recently called Date My Mate. And Date My Mate, again, global phenomenon happening around the world.
How would you pull that into an event, into a corporate event, for goodness sake?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I can answer that question. But I'll tell you what it is, because I think one of the things that's interesting about this is this breakdown, breaking the barriers between business events and just normal life.
Yeah.
And that goes both ways. And I think we're starting to see sort of presentations are becoming part of the wider culture. So, for example, during the pandemic, lots of people were having PowerPoint parties. That was a thing. Yeah. Date My Mate is a kind of extension of that, where this is partly a sort of like, again, it all plays into the same thing. This is taking dating back into the real world. So away from apps, back into the real world. The idea is that you are invited, you have to go along and pitch your mate to all the other single people at the event. So you have to do a short presentation to say why your mate is so eligible. You'll have some images, you'll make a nice presentation, you'll present it, quite quickly. So those kind of things, where they're just inherently fun.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't know. I'm not quite sure how we'll use that, but it's there.
Right.
And
it's going to happen at some point. One of your clients is going to experience it. That's great. Isn't budget a challenge to implementing some of the things you've talked about?
I think less than people think.
Really?
Yeah, because I think a lot of the time, unboring events, making events, more joyous, more effective, is actually about sweating the small stuff. When it comes to events, there are so many big, important things that have to be thought about. And I'm not diminishing any of these for 1 minute. The really important stuff, like venue, like health and safety, like making sure that you've got good logistics, that the catering is fantastic. All those kind of things take up the bandwidth.
Yeah.
And what then happens is that the smaller moments where you really can sort of make a difference too often get overlooked. So a brilliant example. Now, I'm sorry to say that we weren't responsible for this, but whoever was responsible for it, I take my hat off to them. Yeah. So Canva did their, I saw this somewhere online, that Canva did their large customer event, huge event, beautiful event. And as you'd expect for Canva, the screen content looked fantastic. Really nice slides, really well designed. But then they just did something that went the extra mile. They had what they call color coordinated keynotes. So the presenters' outfits matched content on the screen. That is a brilliant example of unboring. It's brilliant, but it's like absolutely grounded in the brand.
Yeah. And
to the point about budget, I'm sure not really an issue.
Oh, that's such a good example.
Yeah, and I mean, again, some of the formats we were talking about, Formats typically don't cost a lot of money to implement.
Yeah.
So the ones I've been talking about. The other example that I like, that somebody in the office went to an event where the agenda was printed on a chocolate bar, and it was just, what a clever sort of joyous idea. And but all too often, that is the sort of thing that gets put by the wayside because of all of the the big important stuff that needs to be thought about. Yeah. And I guess that's something we're always trying to push at Live Union. We're always trying to say, make sure you build in time to look at those little touch points, because often they are where the memories lie.
I'm going to nick that idea for another event. That's coming. Chocolate bar. So how do you make unboring part of your practice?
One of the things we've done consistently since we started the agency was a program that we call That's Interesting. And everybody in the agency is encouraged to find ideas from the far corners of the event landscape. And we have now we have a kind of Teams channel where they all sit. Then once a month, we do a newsletter that goes out called That's Interesting. And that is about sharing the kind of things that I've been talking about today, just sharing that kind of left field inspiration that might then, that might then find a home within a business event. So that's the kind of, I guess that's the sort of, sourcing all of the ideas and bringing them into the agency. The next thing, of course, is then they need to be deployed in a rigorous way. And we have an experience design framework process that we take clients through that is all about, everything from like framing the experience, finding the red thread, all the way through ultimately to honing the formats. But having those ideas in your head, having them in the lifeblood of the agency, mean that process of designing the event, not only does the process become fun, but it means that those ideas actually get built into events.
I love it. You started the podcast talking about the fact that 3/4 of audiences are neutral towards B2B content. From an event perspective, are you optimistic that this is going to change? I'm guessing you are, yeah?
Yeah, I am. And listen, it's one of the, to you, what's that quote? The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Yeah. And there are fantastic B2B events happening the whole time. I don't want to deny that. And the ones we do, the ones that our peer group of agencies do. But the reality is probably 90% of business events don't have an agency behind them. They're just they're happening day in, day out. Yeah. And there are a lot of events that are struggling because audience expectations have gone up. And far too many events are designed for an audience that don't exist anymore. Events that they're overstuffed with content. They don't leave enough time for conversation, which is, all of the research suggests the reason people go to events today is for conversation. That said, the analog revival that we're seeing in the wider world, people's appetite for going to events, some of the ones I've talked about, Date My Mate and, all those, the Do lectures that you went to, there is an incredible appetite for face-to-face, and events have a fundamental power that other channels don't have. So in my view, as the world becomes even more digital, as AI gets a hold, the attraction for well-designed events is going to be overpowering.
Now, how is the challenge different for the event sector?
Well, I started by talking about the fact that the stakes are so high, and the fact that senior people, are involved, and that we need to be incredibly mindful of what we ask senior people to do at events. Yeah. So, we've already talked about that. I think there's another way of looking at this, which is traditionally the B2B event world has been quite isolating. There haven't been forums for people sharing ideas like there are, I think if you worked in advertising or if you worked in digital, there are endless kind of forums and media where people are coming together and sharing ideas. And that is less so in the events world. And that's why, the work that you guys do at Elevate, of bringing people together, of being a platform for sharing ideas, of being a platform for helping people across generations to share ideas, that I think is a really, really encouraging sign for how we can tackle this kind of, this unboring B2B events challenge.
Jez, that is all brilliant stuff. Can you give our listeners something immediate that they can take away and implement, from our conversation or not, but there, just something that the people can immediately do something with.
Yes. I think all of that conversation really fits into under three headlines. So when you're thinking about an event, ask yourself, or challenge yourself in three areas. Firstly, don't design a business event. Secondly, do design an event you'd like to go to. And thirdly, sweat the small stuff.
Thank you so much, Jez. That's brilliant. Absolutely.
I've done this workshop quite a few times now. So I know my topic.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I'm sure everyone listening will as well.
Thank you.
Elevate operates thanks to the generosity of our global headline partners, Amplify, Seed, and Wonder. Our global partners are Cvent, Identity, First, Illusion, Incomp, Powwow, PSP, and the production department. Our partners are the Assemble Group, Castle Bell, Curious Nation, and Jimmy Garcia Catering. Our venue partner is White Rabbit Studios, our training partner is Special Source Training, and our people and culture partners are Zoe Tufts from Times 10 Coaching and Nick Newell. Together we're changing lives, careers, and the events industry for the better. Our sound engineer is
Matteo Magariello,
and our producer is me, Peter Kerwood. This podcast was recorded at White Rabbit Studios in Shoreditch.